Welcome to Old Worlds for Sleep, where forgotten streets, quiet hearts, and untold histories come alive beneath the hush of night. Here we travel slowly, through candlelight and cobblestone, through winters that never quite end, and through the small mercies that keep people human, even when the world turns cold. Tonight's story is called The Winter Letters. It begins in Victorian London, a city wrapped in fog, hunger, and faith. A father searching for work. A mother holding her family together with nothing but love and a small fire. And a letter, lost to the river, that somehow finds its way home. It's a story of survival, of kindness in the hardest season, and of how even in the deepest cold, a single flame, or a single word, can still warm the soul. So dim the lights. Let the sound of rain soften your thoughts, and drift with us now, back to a London of snow, silence, and quiet resilience. This is The Winter Letters, only here on Old Worlds for Sleep. The frost had come early that year. Before the bells of St. Paul struck December, London was already dressed in white, a brittle, ghostly kind of white that clung to every roof tile and carriage wheel. Along the narrow lanes of Southwark, where chimney smoke curled low over the river fog, men walked slower, their breath turning to clouds that drifted past their worn caps. Thomas Elroy stood among them, hands deep in his coat, feeling the thin cloth do little to stop the cold. He had worked once, a porter at the docks, strong-backed and steady. But the ships had slowed, trade had thinned, and strength meant little when there was no cargo to carry. For weeks, his only work had been walking the streets, scanning signs, hoping one might read, "Help wanted." He stopped outside a bakery window. Inside, the glow of the oven painted golden light on the walls. A boy carried out a tray of bread, steam rising like a promise. Thomas smiled faintly, not at the bread, but at the thought of his son Elias, waiting back in their small lodging room. "Just one more day," he whispered, as if saying it aloud could make it true. Behind him, a horse's hooves clattered past. A man in a tall hat grumbled at the weather, cursing the frost that slowed his carriage. Thomas turned his face away, not in shame, but to hide the twitch of resentment that always came when the rich complained of what the poor simply endured. He crossed the bridge as fog rose from the Thames, rolling over the water like ghosts of forgotten sailors. Beneath his boots, the wood was slick with ice. He thought of Elias again, his cough, the way the boy tried to smile through the wheezing. "It's just the air, father," he'd said last night, voice thin as thread. "It makes my chest feel tight." The air, yes. The London air, filled with soot, smoke, and sorrow. By the time Thomas reached Borough Market, the vendors were already shouting into the mist. Bread, 3 farthings a loaf. Hot potatoes, 2 a penny. Coal, fine and dry. But no one called for laborers. No one asked for hands like his. He leaned against a post, rubbing warmth into his fingers. Around him, people hurried, women clutching baskets, men with tools, children darting between them like shadows. Everyone seemed to be moving somewhere, doing something. Only Thomas stood still, watching the world pass him by. A small sound broke his thoughts, the faint cry of a baby from across the street. A woman sat wrapped in rags by the wall, rocking the child beneath her shawl. Her face was pale, lips blue. Thomas hesitated, then stepped closer. He had 1 coin, enough for half a loaf, maybe less. He looked at her eyes, hollow but alive, and he knew what he must do. He pressed the coin into her hand and said softly, "Buy something warm." She looked up, startled. "But, what of you?" Thomas smiled the way men do when they have no real answer. "I've bread waiting at home." He didn't. But perhaps kindness could fill an empty stomach for a while. As he walked away, the city bells tolled noon. The fog thickened. Somewhere beyond the river, the faint hum of factory whistles called men to labor. But not him. Not today. Still, Thomas straightened his coat and kept walking. Because that was what men like him did, they kept walking. Through frost, through hunger, through the long silence of the winter streets. And as he turned onto Tanner's Lane, the thought of Elias waiting in the dim room upstairs gave him one small flame inside. A fragile, flickering thing, but a flame nonetheless. Tell me, if you were in Thomas's shoes, would you have given that last coin away? Or would you have kept it, for your own child waiting at home? Do you think kindness can warm a man even when the world stays cold? The narrow stairs creaked beneath Thomas's boots as he climbed, one hand clutching the banister slick with frost that had crept even inside the building. The smell of boiled cabbage and damp coal clung to the air, the familiar perfume of poverty. Doors lined the hallway, some cracked open, revealing brief glimpses of other lives. An old man coughing, a woman sewing by candlelight, a child curled in sleep beside a brazier's faint glow. Their own door was near the top, third on the left. The latch stuck as usual, and he had to shoulder it gently before it gave way with a groan. Inside, the room was dim, the single window half frozen over, the last light of day filtering through the ice like stained glass. His wife, Clara, was seated near the hearth, if one could call the blackened brick corner a hearth, feeding the last lumps of coal into a flickering flame. The fire was so small it barely lit her face. She looked up as he entered, eyes shadowed with worry. "Any luck?" Thomas shook his head. "None today. The docks are quiet, and the market's full of men already waiting." Clara nodded once without surprise. Disappointment had become too common for words. She turned slightly, revealing Elias bundled beneath layers of blankets on the bed. The boy's cheeks were flushed, his breath shallow but steady. Thomas crossed the room in 3 quick strides and knelt beside him. "Still warm," Clara murmured, her voice soft but tight. "He coughed less this morning, but I can hear it rattling deep." Thomas placed a hand against his son's brow. It burned beneath his touch. "We'll find a doctor soon," he said automatically, though both knew it was a promise made of air. "Did you eat anything?" Clara asked, watching him as she might a man teetering on the edge of a cliff. He smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Not hungry." She didn't press. The lie was too thin, but pride was a fragile thing, and in this room they guarded it fiercely. From beneath the blanket, Elias stirred. "Father?" His voice was no more than a whisper. "I'm here, lad. Did you bring bread?" Thomas hesitated, then reached into his coat and drew out the small cloth bundle Clara had wrapped for him yesterday, half a crust, now hard as stone. He broke a piece off and placed it in Elias's hand. The boy chewed slowly, each bite an effort, but his eyes brightened all the same. "There'll be more tomorrow," Thomas said softly. "A bit of meat, maybe. The carters sometimes need extra hands after a frost." Elias smiled, drowsy but hopeful. "Then we'll have stew again?" "If luck allows." Clara met Thomas's gaze across the small room. They both knew stew required more than luck. It required money and mercy from shopkeepers. Still, in this fragile world, hope itself was nourishment. The fire dimmed again. Clara sighed and reached for the cold tin, finding it empty. "We'll have to stretch what we've got," she said. Thomas stood and crossed to the window. Outside, the snow was falling thicker now, coating the street lamps, softening the city's edges. The sound was almost peaceful, almost. "Tomorrow I'll go early," he said. "Maybe to the butcher's on Borough Road. He sometimes hires for unloading." Clara nodded absently, rubbing her hands together to warm them. "You'll catch your death in this weather." "I'll not die till Elias eats proper bread again." She smiled faintly at that. In a city that devoured men by the thousand, such defiance was almost holy. He sat beside her, both of them watching the tiny fire fight its losing battle against the cold. The shadows crept closer as evening deepened. From somewhere below, a woman began to sing, a slow, cracked lullaby that rose through the floorboards and settled like a ghost in their room. Thomas reached for Clara's hand. "We'll make it through this winter," he said, as though the words themselves could build walls against the frost. Clara squeezed his fingers, her touch fragile but warm. "We always do," she whispered. Outside, the snow kept falling, silent and unending, blanketing London in its indifferent grace. Inside, 3 hearts beat on, weak but together. If you close your eyes, can you hear the sound of that little fire? The whisper of snow outside a cracked window? Would you have told the same lies of comfort, if someone you loved needed them to survive the night? Morning came gray and bitter. The frost had crept along the inside of the window pane in lace-like patterns, delicate as spider silk. Thomas woke before dawn, the cold biting at his nose, his breath misting faintly in the dim light of the dying fire. Clara still slept lightly beside Elias, one arm draped protectively over their boy, as though she could shield him from the chill itself. He dressed in silence, layering what little he had, his frayed coat, the scarf worn thin by years of winters. The boots were cracked, the soles patched twice over, but they still held together. He bent near Elias and whispered, "I'll be back soon, my lad. Keep that fire going for me, eh?" The boy stirred, murmured something about stew, and drifted back into shallow sleep. That small whisper, the dream of a meal, followed Thomas down the narrow stairs and into the freezing dawn. Outside, the world was white and still. Snow had settled on every lamppost and cartwheel, turning the city into something almost beautiful, if one didn't have to survive in it. His breath made tiny clouds in the pale air as he walked, each step crunching softly on the frozen street. Borough Road was waking slowly. Vendors stamped their feet beside shuttered stalls, blowing into their hands for warmth. Across the way, the butcher's shop was already lit from within, the glow spilling onto the snow like spilled gold. Thomas hesitated at the corner, nerves fluttering like a bird in his chest. The last time he'd asked for work there, the man had said, "No room for loafers." Still, it was morning, a new day, and desperation had no pride. He stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of meat and smoke. Hooks gleamed faintly in the lamplight, hung with sides of pork and strings of sausages. Behind the counter stood Mr. Hargreaves, a broad man with a red face and hands that always seemed slightly blood-stained. His apron was spotless, though. That was his way, clean where it counted, messy where it didn't. Thomas removed his cap. "Morning, sir." The butcher looked up from his ledger. "You again, Elroy? Thought I told you I've got more lads than work." "You did, sir," Thomas said quietly, "but I thought maybe with the storm." Hargreaves grunted. Storms made a right mess of things. Deliveries delayed. Carts stuck north of the river. He scratched his chin. "Could use a hand clearing the lane, maybe fetching some crates if they ever arrive." Thomas's heart thudded. "I can do that, sir. Strong back still, and I'll work till sundown." The butcher regarded him a moment, his sharp eyes flicking to the worn coat, the hollow cheeks, the stubbornness that hunger can't quite erase. "6 pence for the day," he said at last. "You shovel the yard, carry what needs carrying. Don't ask questions and don't drop anything." Thomas almost smiled. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Hargreaves turned away, pretending not to see the gratitude. "Start with the alley out back. There's a cart frozen solid to the stones. Get it loose if you can. And mind the horse. Mean bastard." Outside again, Thomas took the shovel from its place by the door. The wood was splintered, the metal blade dull, but it didn't matter. He set to work. Each scrape of metal against ice echoed down the narrow street. The cold burned at first, in his hands, in his lungs, but soon the rhythm took over. Scrape, lift, throw. Breath in, breath out. One motion at a time. Hours passed. He hardly noticed. The ache in his back became part of him, the same way the hunger did, always there but distant, dulled by movement and purpose. When the butcher came out with a mug of tea near midday, steam rising like a blessing, Thomas took it in both hands. "Thank you, sir." Hargreaves shrugged. "Cold kills good help. Can't have that." He hesitated a moment, then added, "You've a boy, haven't you? Sickly little one?" "Yes, sir. Elias. Chest's bad." The butcher grunted again, as though the memory of the boy's face flickered briefly in his mind. "My missus made too much stew last night. I'll send a bit home with you. No sense wasting good food." Thomas blinked, unsure if he'd heard right. "That's kind of you, sir." "Not kindness," the butcher muttered. "Just waste makes me angry." But as the man went back inside, Thomas allowed himself a small, private smile. In this city, kindness often came disguised as practicality, but it was kindness all the same. When dusk came, his shoulders were sore, his fingers numb, but he stood a little straighter. 6 pence in his pocket. A parcel of food under his arm. The street lamps flickered to life one by one, halos of gold in the falling snow. And for the first time in weeks, he felt the faintest sense of victory. Not triumph, just survival. But in winter London, that was enough. If you were there, would you have noticed the kindness hiding behind the butcher's gruffness? Do you think mercy always wears a gentle face, or sometimes a rough one? And when was the last time a small act changed your whole day? The snow had thickened by the time Thomas reached home. The city lamps glowed like pale moons through the mist, and his footprints vanished almost as soon as he made them. In one hand he held the day's wage, 6 small coins still warm from his palm. In the other, a wrapped parcel from the butcher, the faint smell of stew escaping through the paper. He paused at the foot of the stairs before climbing, taking a moment just to breathe. The simple weight of food felt heavier than gold. Inside, the building hummed with low voices and coughing. Someone laughed in the next room, a tired, cracked kind of laughter. A baby cried 2 doors down. The sounds of 100 lives pressed together by walls too thin to keep any of them apart. Thomas's boots left dark prints on the worn steps. At the top, their door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light spilling out. He pushed it open, and the familiar scent of coal smoke and damp blankets wrapped around him like an old coat. Clara looked up first. "You're home." Her voice carried a mix of relief and disbelief, as though every time he went out, she feared he might never come back. "Home," he said simply, setting down the parcel. "And with work today. Butcher's yard." Her eyes flicked to the package, then back to him. "Is that?" "Stew," he said, smiling faintly. "And enough for all of us." Before she could speak, a small voice from the bed cut in. "Stew." Elias had woken, his eyes wide, face flushed but brighter than yesterday. Thomas grinned and crossed the room, kneeling beside him. "Aye, lad. Meat and vegetables both. The butcher said it'd keep us strong." The boy laughed softly, the sound thin but real. "Then I'll be strong by morning." "I've no doubt you will," Thomas said, smoothing his hair. Clara unwrapped the parcel near the hearth, and for a moment, the room filled with the fragrance of warmth. Onions, beef, pepper, marrow, all mingled together in a scent that could make a starving man cry. She poured the contents into their one pot, added a little water, and set it to heat. The flame flickered higher as Thomas fed the last of the coal beneath it. The sound of bubbling broth filled the silence, a lullaby for hungry hearts. Outside, the wind howled faintly, scraping against the window panes. Inside, it was a world apart, a small island of light in the endless dark. Elias watched every movement, eyes shining. "It smells like Sundays used to," he whispered. Clara turned, her expression soft. "Then we'll call tonight a Sunday, The boy nodded solemnly, as if declaring it made it true. Thomas sat back, stretching his sore arms. The ache in his shoulders felt almost good now, proof that his body still worked, that he could still provide. The coins on the table gleamed faintly in the firelight. 9 pence in total, he murmured. Enough for coal tomorrow. Maybe bread too. Clara looked over at him, pride and exhaustion mingling in her eyes. "You did well, Tom." He shrugged, embarrassed. "Just work. But it's something." When the stew was ready, she ladled small portions into each tin bowl. The broth shimmered golden, tiny flecks of fat glistening on the surface. Elias took his first sip and closed his eyes. "It's perfect," he whispered. For a while no one spoke. They just ate, slowly, reverently, as though each spoonful might vanish if they moved too fast. Thomas glanced around the room. The frost still clung to the window edges, the blankets still thin, but something in the air had shifted. The fear that had sat like a weight in his chest all week had loosened its hold. When they were done, Clara poured the last drops of broth into a cup and placed it by the window to cool. A portion for tomorrow, though she knew it might never last that long. Waste was sin in winter. Elias leaned back, eyes heavy. "It feels warm again," he murmured. Clara brushed a hand across his forehead. "That's what full bellies do, love." Thomas smiled, watching them both. "Sleep now, lad. You've earned it." The boy's breathing slowed, deep and even, the rattle in his chest quiet for the first time in days. Clara exhaled softly, a sound halfway between relief and prayer. Outside, the snow kept falling. The city slept beneath it, wrapped in silence. But in that little room, 3 souls glowed like embers, faint, fragile, and beautiful. Have you ever felt that kind of warmth? Not from fire, but from the people beside you? Would you call that love, or simply survival? And do you think perhaps the two are the same? Night had deepened over London. The snow outside glowed faintly under the gas lamps, turning the streets into rivers of pale light. From their small window, Thomas could see flakes drifting past like slow-falling ash. The world was hushed, wrapped in a silence that only winter could command. Inside, the fire had burned low, its warmth fading into gentle embers. Clara sat in the chair by the hearth, mending Elias's shirt by what little light remained. Thomas dozed upright against the wall, exhaustion pulling at his limbs. The boy slept soundly for the first time in days, his breathing soft, steady, no longer the desperate rasp of sickness. For the first time all week there was peace. Then came the knock. It was faint at first, almost lost beneath the sigh of the wind. A soft tap-tap-tap against the door. Clara froze mid-stitch, her needle glinting in the dim glow. Thomas stirred, half awake, thinking at first it was a dream. But then it came again, tap tap tap, deliberate, patient, waiting. He rose carefully, glancing toward the bed. Elias didn't stir. Clara set her mending aside, her voice barely above a whisper. At this hour? Thomas nodded. Could be the landlord. Or worse, she murmured. He crossed to the door, boots silent on the worn floorboards, and lifted the latch. A gust of cold air swept in, carrying flakes of snow that shimmered briefly in the firelight before melting away. On the threshold stood an older woman, wrapped in a shawl too thin for the weather. Her cheeks were raw from the wind, her eyes sharp but kind. In her hands she held a small pail. Steam rose from it faintly. "Evening, Mr. Elroy," she said. Her voice was cracked but steady. "Mrs. Higgins," Thomas replied, recognizing the neighbor from 2 doors down. "You'll freeze out there. Come in quick." She stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots. "Didn't mean to wake the boy," she said softly, glancing toward the bed. "But I heard your fire dying. Thought you could use a bit more heat." She lifted the pail. "Brought coals from my stove. Still good and hot." Clara was already moving to make space near the hearth. "Oh, you shouldn't have." "Nonsense," Mrs. Higgins interrupted. "You'd have done the same. The way I see it, winter's an enemy best fought together." Thomas helped her pour the glowing coals into their grate. The flame caught again, brightening, sending a ripple of gold across the small room. For a moment it almost looked warm. Mrs. Higgins settled into the empty chair, rubbing her hands together. "Smells like stew in here," she said approvingly. "You've done well, Tom. Most nights I've not but broth myself." He smiled modestly. The butcher was kind. "Sent it home with me." "Kind?" she chuckled. "Or smart enough to keep his workers alive." They shared a quiet laugh, the kind that didn't banish hardship but made it bearable. Clara poured what little tea they had left into a cup, pushing it gently toward their visitor. "It's weak but warm," she said. Mrs. Higgins took it gratefully. "Warm is enough." For a time they simply sat together, 3 adults bound by fatigue and necessity, watching the fire as though it were a living thing. Outside, the snow fell harder, whispering against the window panes. Inside, silence settled like a blanket. Then Mrs. Higgins spoke again, her tone softer. "I passed by the pump on Chester Street. Frozen solid. They say it won't be working again for days." Clara sighed. "Then we'll have to fetch from the public pump again. 3 streets away." The older woman nodded slowly. "I can go with you in the morning. 2 pairs of hands are better than 1. Thomas looked at her with quiet gratitude. "You shouldn't trouble yourself." She met his gaze firmly. "It's no trouble when it keeps us all alive." The fire crackled, filling the silence with small, comforting sounds. Elias shifted in his sleep and murmured something. A dream, perhaps, about summer fields or bread warm from the oven. The kind of dream only children could still have in winter. When Mrs. Higgins rose to leave, Thomas offered to walk her back to her door. The hallway was dim, the floorboards icy underfoot. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for the coal and for the company." She smiled faintly. "We do what we can, Tom. The city forgets about us down here, but we don't forget each other." At her door, she paused, eyes narrowing as if seeing through the thin walls and miles of snow. "Keep the boy warm," she said. "The frost's not done with us yet." When Thomas returned, the fire was burning brighter, throwing long shadows across the room. Clara had gone to bed, her hand resting protectively on Elias's shoulder. He sat by the hearth a while longer, watching the flames twist and sigh. The city outside was still vast and uncaring. The cold would come again. But here, in this one small room, there was warmth enough for the night. Have you ever been saved by a small kindness? One you didn't expect but never forgot? And if you could knock on someone's door tonight, whose fire would you bring back to life? Morning came without light. The clouds hung low, swollen with more snow, and a damp cold pressed through the walls like an unwelcome guest. The fire had burned itself out during the night, leaving only a faint glow in the grate. Clara was already awake, kneeling near the ashes, coaxing them gently with a stick, as though whispering an old spell to wake the warmth again. Thomas stirred from his chair, stiff from sleeping upright. For a few seconds the room felt peaceful. Elias still slept, his breathing steady, the world still quiet. Then came the sound. A sharp crack, not thunder but something close. followed by a rush of water echoing down the stairwell. Clara looked up. "Tom, what was that?" He was already moving to the door. When he opened it, a cold mist hit his face, icy, damp, and full of panic. Voices rose from below, shouts, hurried footsteps, curses muffled by the fog of breath. Thomas leaned over the banister. Below, lanterns flickered as tenants crowded the lower hall. Water poured from a burst pipe near the wall, spraying like a fountain gone mad. The floor glistened with ice, and men were shouting over one another, "Turn the main off. You'll flood the rooms? The landlord won't pay a penny for this." He descended the stairs 2 at a time. The cold bit through his boots as he waded into the spreading water. One of the older tenants, Mr. Coughlin, was fumbling with the stop valve, his hands blue from the chill. Frozen solid, the man grunted. "Won't turn." "Let me try," Thomas said. He took the wrench, bracing it against the pipe, and twisted with all the strength he had left. It groaned, resisted, then finally gave with a violent jerk. The gushing slowed, then stopped, leaving only the hiss of escaping steam and the murmurs of weary relief. But the damage was done. The hall was already a shallow pool, the water turning slick as it froze against the stone floor. The landlord, Mr. Phillips, appeared moments later, his expression more irritated than concerned. He wore a heavy coat lined with fur, a ridiculous contrast to the dripping misery around him. "What's all this now?" he demanded. "I can't have the building flooded, I'll be ruined." Thomas turned toward him, holding the wrench loosely in one hand. "The pipes burst," he said simply. "You'll need a plumber." "Plumber?" Phillips scoffed. "At this hour? In this weather? They'll charge triple. You people must have kept the doors open, let the frost in." A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd. An old woman shouted from the stairs, "You've not repaired that pipe in 2 winters, Mr. Phillips. It's rusted through." He ignored her, muttering about careless tenants and ungrateful mouths. Thomas stepped forward, his voice calm but steady. "You'll have to fix it, sir. If it freezes again, the whole wall might give way." The landlord glared at him, opening his mouth to retort. But just then, a splash echoed down the corridor as part of the ceiling cracked, sending icy water cascading across the hall. Phillips's outrage faltered into fear. "Fine," he snapped. "I'll fetch a man tomorrow. But this isn't my doing, mark my words." He turned on his heel and left, boots squelching in the half-frozen mess. When Thomas climbed back upstairs, his coat soaked through, the cold felt sharper than before. Clara met him at the door with a blanket. "The pipe burst," he said, rubbing his hands. "They'll not fix it tonight." She looked past him toward the stairwell where voices still echoed. "So we'll have no water?" "For days, maybe. Not unless someone carries it from the pump 3 streets away." Clara pressed her lips together, thinking of the walk, the cold, the distance, the buckets. "We'll manage," she said finally. "We always do." Thomas smiled faintly at her resolve, even as fatigue settled into his bones. "Mrs. Higgins might have a rain barrel yet. I'll ask her." At that moment, Elias coughed, a dry, rattling sound that sent both of them spinning toward the bed. The boy's face was flushed again, sweat glistening on his brow. Clara touched his forehead. "He's burning, Tom." Thomas swallowed hard. The doctor said to send word if it worsened. Outside, the snow had started again, heavier this time, falling in thick, silent curtains that blurred the world beyond the window. The city seemed to hold its breath, every sound muted beneath the weight of winter. Thomas stood, reaching for his coat once more. "I'll fetch him," he said. "Now." "In this storm?" Clara's voice cracked. "It's near midnight." He met her eyes, tired, determined, afraid, but unwilling to surrender. "If we wait until morning," he said softly, "it might be too late." He kissed Elias's damp forehead, pulled his scarf tight, and opened the door. The cold struck him like a blow, sharp, relentless. He took one last look at his family, silhouetted by the faint glow of the fire. Then he stepped out into the storm. Would you have gone too if someone you loved lay between life and death? Have you ever felt the kind of fear that makes you move before you can think? And tell me, do you believe courage is louder than the wind? The door closed behind him with a dull thud, cutting off the small warmth of home. Outside, the world had turned to silence. Snow fell thick and steady, blurring every edge, swallowing every sound. The street lamps flickered dimly behind curtains of white, their halos trembling in the storm like candle flames before a breath. Thomas pulled his scarf higher, the wool stiff with frost. The air stung his cheeks, sharp as glass, and each breath felt like drawing knives into his lungs. He hunched his shoulders, head down, and began to walk. At first, the streets were familiar. Tanner's Lane, with its leaning chimneys and crooked doors, the butcher's shop now shuttered and dark. He passed it quickly, the memory of warmth and work cutting deeper than the cold. The sign above the door creaked in the wind, swinging gently as if watching him go. He turned toward Borough Road. The snow there lay untouched, a perfect, unbroken sheet. His boots sank deep, leaving prints that filled almost as soon as they formed. London, usually so loud and restless, felt like a city asleep, dreaming beneath its white shroud. Every few steps, he passed shapes half lost in the storm. A stray cart, a dog rooting through bins, a figure slumped in a doorway. Some slept, some didn't move at all. He tried not to look too closely. The city had many ways to swallow its poor, and not all of them were quick. He walked faster, partly to fight the cold, partly to fight the fear. The doctor lived nearly 2 miles away, near the parish square, a long walk on a good day. Tonight it felt endless. A gust of wind tore down the street, carrying snow and soot. Thomas turned his face away, pressing against a wall until it passed. The cold found every seam in his clothing, every patch in his boots. His fingers had gone numb long ago. Still he pressed on. Halfway there, the bell of St. George's tolled 3 times, soft, distant, muffled by the snow. 3 in the morning. The hour of ghosts, the hour of doubt. He stopped to catch his breath beneath an iron lamppost. The faint light revealed his face, raw from wind, lips cracked, eyes hollow but alive. Steam rose from his breath in small, trembling clouds. For a moment he thought of turning back. Just for warmth, for comfort, for safety. But then he saw Elias's face in his mind, flushed, gasping, eyes wide and frightened. He remembered the tiny sound of his breathing, like a bird trapped in his chest. And that memory burned hotter than any fire. He pushed forward. The city changed as he neared the doctor's district. The houses grew taller, cleaner. The snow here lay untouched, white and quiet, as though suffering stopped at the edge of wealth. Curtains glowed faintly behind frosted glass, yellow squares of warmth that might as well have been another world. Thomas's steps slowed. His own reflection stared back from the window of a closed bakery, gaunt, dusted white, eyes ringed with exhaustion. A man caught between shadow and snow. He almost didn't recognize himself. At last, he reached the doctor's house, a narrow building with a brass plate by the door, faintly gleaming under the gaslight. His breath came in ragged bursts as he lifted his hand to knock. The wood was cold beneath his knuckles, and for a moment, he hesitated. What if the doctor refused to come? What if the child was already? No, he couldn't think it. He knocked once, then again, louder. A light flickered upstairs. Moments later, the door creaked open. The doctor appeared in his dressing gown, hair tousled from sleep, eyes sharp even in the dim light. "Good heavens," he muttered, taking in Thomas's snow-caked coat, the tremor in his hands. "What are you doing out in this?" "My boy," Thomas managed, voice hoarse. "He's worse. He can't breathe proper. The fever's back. Please, sir." The doctor's expression softened immediately. "You're the Elroys from Southwark, yes? I remember." He stepped back. "Wait here." He disappeared into the house, leaving the door ajar. Warmth spilled into the night, golden and gentle. It smelled faintly of tea and tobacco, the scent of comfort. Thomas stood trembling on the step, half from cold, half from hope. The doctor returned, now fully dressed, his bag in hand. "We'll take the carriage," he said briskly. "You couldn't walk back in this, and neither should I." Thomas blinked. "Your carriage, sir?" The doctor smiled faintly. "You think I'd let a man who's walked through a blizzard lead me on foot? Come quickly now. We'll see to your boy." The sound of hooves soon broke the quiet as the small carriage emerged from the stable, its lanterns glowing softly against the storm. The doctor motioned for him to climb in. "You've done well to reach me at all," he said as they set off. "Few men would have dared it." Thomas stared out into the white darkness, voice low. "Few men have a child worth the walk. Would you have knocked through snow and fear and miles of night? Have you ever chased hope so far that it nearly froze you? And if you had to, would you do it again, just to save someone breathing softly in the dark?" The doctor's carriage was a modest thing, Black wood, small wheels, the kind used by parish physicians who traveled endlessly through the poorer districts. Yet to Thomas, it felt like a vessel of warmth in an ocean of white. When he climbed in, the door shut behind him with a heavy click, sealing out the storm. The sudden quiet felt strange, almost holy. The doctor gave a low whistle, and the horse moved forward, hooves striking rhythmically against the snow-packed street. The wheels creaked but held steady. Lanterns swung gently at either side, casting soft circles of gold through the swirling dark. For a while neither man spoke. Only the sounds of travel, the soft snort of the horse, the muffled crunch of snow, the faint whistle of wind through the carriage cracks. Then in that hush the doctor glanced at Thomas. "You walked all the way from Southwark?" "Yes, sir." The doctor gave a quiet shake of his head. "In this weather? 2 miles, perhaps more." Thomas looked down at his gloved hands, thin, stiff, more cloth than warmth. "Couldn't wait till morning," he said. He was struggling. "I know," the doctor murmured. "You did the right thing." The carriage swayed slightly as it turned a corner. Through the frosted window, the world passed like a moving painting. Rooftops thick with snow, iron fences glistening with ice, doors shuttered tight against the cold. Here, in the richer streets, the snow seemed softer somehow, as though even winter was kinder to the wealthy. Thomas noticed the doctor watching him, not unkindly but curiously. "You've a family of your own, sir?" he asked quietly. The doctor smiled faintly. "No. Medicine has a way of stealing such things from a man. Too many hours, too many nights. I've lost patience, and almost lost myself once or twice." He paused, then looked directly at Thomas. "But I've never lost a father who'd walk through a blizzard for his child." Thomas said nothing. He didn't trust his voice. Outside, the snow grew heavier, flakes catching in the lantern light like drifting ash. The horse slowed, laboring through the deepening drifts. The doctor leaned forward, murmuring gently to the animal, then settled back again. His tone softened. "Tell me, how long has the boy been ill?" "For days," Thomas said. "Started with a cough. We thought it was just the cold air. Then the fever came. Couldn't keep food down." "And the others?" "My wife Clara. Our daughter Emma. They've kept the fire going such as it is. We've coal enough for tonight, thanks to a neighbor." The doctor nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Higgins?" Thomas blinked. "You know her?" "I do. She's brought me tea more than once, when my hands could barely hold a pen. The old souls of this city do more good than half its ministers." They fell quiet again. Outside the storm howled. Inside, the lantern light flickered across their faces. One weary, one thoughtful, both marked by the same sleepless worry. After a time, the doctor spoke again, almost to himself. "I sometimes wonder," he said, "what it would take to make London less cruel. War perhaps, or mercy. And yet, it always comes down to individuals, doesn't it? One man walking through the snow. One mother keeping a fire alive. Small acts that keep the whole great machine of the world from freezing." Thomas nodded slowly. "We don't have much else to fight with." The doctor's eyes softened. "You fight better than most, Mr. Elroy." The carriage jolted suddenly, the wheel catching on a hidden rut beneath the snow. The horse whinnied, the lantern swayed violently. Thomas gripped the seat, heart pounding, until the carriage righted itself again. The doctor muttered a calm word to the horse, soothing it. "All right," he said, glancing out the window. "Nearly there. Another half mile, perhaps." Thomas exhaled, tension easing. "Thank God." "Thank perseverance," the doctor corrected gently. "God's a fine listener, but he's left the walking to us." For a long moment, they rode in silence. 2 men moving through a frozen city, the glow of their lanterns cutting narrow paths through the storm. And though Thomas's body trembled with cold and exhaustion, something within him began to warm. Not just from the carriage, but from the simple fact that he wasn't alone in the night anymore. At last, the familiar outline of the tenement emerged from the fog, a black shape against the snow. The doctor tugged the reins and the carriage slowed to a halt. "Here," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking with relief. "We're here." The doctor looked out into the swirling dark, then back at him. "Let's see if we can't bring a bit of spring into that room of yours, Mr. Elroy." He opened the door, and the cold rushed in like a living thing. Together they stepped out, one man of science, one man of faith in nothing but love, walking side by side through the snow toward the dim light of the Elroy's window. If you'd been there, sitting in that carriage, would you have spoken? Would you have asked the doctor what he truly feared, the cold outside or the cold in men's hearts? And tell me, do you think some strangers are sent to remind us that the world hasn't given up on us yet? When Thomas pushed open the door, warmth met him first, faint, fragile, but there. Clara was by the fire, her face pale in the glow. Elias lay still on the bed, his breath shallow and fast. The small room smelled of broth, coal smoke, and fear. Clara turned, eyes widening as she saw the doctor behind him. "Oh, thank heavens," she whispered. "He's getting worse." The doctor was already beside the bed, his voice calm and even. "Let's see the boy." He set his bag down, the metallic click of its clasp echoing in the hush. Thomas closed the door softly behind them, shutting out the snow and the city. In this room there was only the sound of fire, breath, and time itself. The doctor worked quickly but gently. He lifted Elias's wrist, feeling the weak pulse, then pressed his ear to the boy's chest. His face, normally impassive, tightened slightly. The sound he heard there was the unmistakable rattle of lungs drowning in their own weight. "How long has he breathed like this?" "Since the pipes burst," Clara said. "It came back so sudden. I thought the fever had broken." The doctor nodded. "Pneumonia often fools us with false calm before it deepens." He opened his bag, drawing out small glass bottles, folded cloths, a tiny lamp. The smell of camphor filled the room, sharp, medicinal, clean. Thomas and Clara watched as he worked, helpless but hopeful. Every movement seemed deliberate, careful. The ritual of someone who had done this too many times to count, and still hadn't learned how to stop caring. "Prop him up," the doctor said. "Let him fight for his breath sitting up. It eases the strain." Thomas lifted his son gently, feeling how light he'd become, all bones and heat. He propped him against his own chest, holding him steady as the doctor poured medicine into a spoon. Elias's eyes fluttered open briefly. "Cold?" he murmured. "I know, lad," Thomas whispered, "but you're safe. The doctor's here now." The boy's lips twitched into something like a smile, then parted to take the medicine. For a time, they all stayed like that. The doctor measuring doses, Clara feeding the fire, Thomas holding his son upright as though his strength alone could keep the child alive. Outside, the wind moaned against the window panes, and every few moments a flake of snow slipped through the cracks, melting on the warm floorboards. Hours passed. The fire dimmed, then flared again. The doctor's shadow moved across the walls like a restless ghost. Sometimes he sat, rubbing his eyes. Sometimes he checked Elias's pulse, his chest, his breathing. Always gentle, always listening. At one point, Clara brought him tea, thin and gray, more water than leaf. He took it without hesitation. "Thank you," he said softly, as though she'd offered him gold. Thomas watched, surprised. "You drink what the poor drink?" The doctor smiled faintly. "Tonight I am where the poor live. That makes it taste right." Clara turned away quickly, hiding the tears that rose unbidden. Around them the hours blurred. Elias's breathing came in shallow bursts, then steadied, then faltered again. The doctor adjusted compresses, changed his position, whispered instructions in a voice meant to steady more than instruct. He didn't leave. Didn't even hint at leaving. By the time dawn began to gray the edges of the frost-covered window, the room looked different. Not warmer, not safer, but changed. The doctor dozed in the chair, head bowed, his hands still resting near the boy's pulse. Clara sat beside the bed, eyes half closed, lips moving in a silent prayer. Thomas stood by the window, watching the snow ease into a soft, tired fall. And there, in the quiet between breaths, something shifted. Elias coughed, not the desperate, hollow sound of drowning, but a small, human cough. Then another. Then he sighed and turned slightly, his breathing slower, steadier. The doctor woke instantly, eyes sharp. He pressed his ear to the boy's chest again. The tension in his shoulders eased. "Better?" he whispered. "The medicine is working." Clara leaned forward, her hand trembling as she touched her son's cheek. It was still warm, but not burning. Thomas's knees nearly gave out. He sank into the chair, head in his hands, the sound that escaped him half sob, half relief. The doctor straightened, his tired smile soft. "He's not past danger yet, but he's fighting. And he's young. That counts for much." Clara murmured, "We can pay." He cut her off gently. "You can thank me by keeping him warm. Nothing else matters tonight." For a long while, none of them spoke. The fire hissed, the snow whispered, the boy slept. The night had held its breath, and then quietly had let it go. If you were there, would you have kept the watch too, hour after hour, praying for a single breath? Do you think courage always looks loud, or sometimes it looks like sitting still beside a sick child? And tell me, if dawn came after such a night, would you believe it was mercy or chance? Dawn arrived not with brilliance, but with gentleness. The storm had finally tired itself out. Through the half-frozen window, a pale light crept in, weak, uncertain, but real. The snow outside glowed softly, no longer falling, just lying still, like a tired city catching its breath. Inside the small room, the air was warmer than it had been in days. The fire, fed through the night, had burned low but steady. The smell of smoke and broth lingered like comfort itself. Thomas opened his eyes slowly. For a moment, he didn't remember where he was, only that he was warm and that the silence felt kind instead of cruel. Then he saw Clara, asleep at the bedside, her hand still resting on Elias's blanket. And beside her, the doctor, slumped in the chair, head tilted back, his spectacles slipping down his nose. Thomas rose quietly, joints stiff from the cold floor. He moved closer to the bed, afraid to hope too much. But when he touched Elias's forehead, his hand met cool skin, not feverish, just soft and calm. The boy stirred, lips parting. "Father?" he murmured, voice thin but steady. Thomas froze, then let out a breath that shuddered through his whole body. "I'm here, lad." Elias blinked, eyes clearer than they'd been in days. "Is it morning?" "It is," Thomas whispered. "And you're better." The boy's small smile was answer enough. Across the room, the doctor stirred awake. He rubbed his eyes, straightened his spectacles, and looked immediately toward the bed. When he saw the color back in Elias's cheeks, he nodded once, a quiet satisfaction that spoke more than any grand gesture could. "Good," he said softly. "The danger's past for now." Clara woke at his voice. When she realized what he meant, tears came silently, the kind that fall without sobbing, without words. She pressed her hand to her mouth, afraid to make a sound that might break the spell. Thomas turned to the doctor. "You stayed all night." "I did." He smiled faintly. "Wouldn't have slept otherwise." Clara wiped her eyes, gathering herself. "You must be starving." "We've little but..." The doctor held up a hand. "No need. Seeing him alive is meal enough, Mrs. Elroy." Outside, a few distant sounds began to rise, carts creaking through the slush, vendors shouting to test their voices against the cold. The city, stubborn as ever, was waking. Thomas moved to the window and looked out. The world had changed overnight. Roofs sagged under the weight of snow, icicles hung like crystal daggers from eaves, and the river glinted faintly beneath a thin sheet of ice. Yet there was beauty in it, too, strange, fragile beauty. Even the slums, usually gray and harsh, seemed gentled under their white blanket. "London looks peaceful," he said quietly. The doctor joined him for a moment, peering through the frost. "A rare sight," he murmured. "The city looks innocent when covered in snow, as if trying to forget itself." Behind them, Clara had begun to stir the pot near the fire. The last of the broth was warming. The smell filled the room, rich and savory. Elias shifted weakly, the sound of simmering drawing his attention. "Is that for me?" he whispered. Clara smiled, a soft laugh breaking through her tears. "All for you, my love." Thomas knelt beside him again, brushing his hair from his forehead. "When you're well, we'll make real stew. Meat, potatoes, onions, the works." Elias's eyes brightened. "And bread." "Aye," Thomas said, his throat tight. "And bread." The doctor watched the exchange quietly. Then he turned, began packing his instruments into his worn leather bag. "I'll return tonight," he said. "But I expect more laughter when I do." Clara met his gaze. "You'll have it." When he reached the door, Thomas stopped him. He held out the few coins they had left, 6 pence wrapped in cloth. "Please, sir," he said. "It isn't much, but it's yours." The doctor hesitated. His instinct was to refuse. But then he saw the look in Thomas's eyes, the same fierce pride that had driven him through the storm, and understood. He took half the coins. "For the medicine," he said formally. "The rest keep for coal." Thomas nodded, gratitude and dignity balanced perfectly in that one small moment. As the doctor stepped out into the brightening street, the wind caught his coat, sending flakes spinning into the air. For the first time in days, the sky above London showed the faintest streak of blue. Inside, Clara placed a steaming cup of broth in Thomas's hands. He took a sip, eyes closing as warmth spread through him. The sound of Elias's breathing filled the silence, soft, rhythmic, human. And for the first time that winter, the Elroy's room didn't feel like a place of survival. It felt just barely like home. If you woke to find the storm gone, would you believe it had ended, or only paused? Have you ever watched someone come back from the edge breath by breath? And tell me, do you think hope tastes different when you've earned it with fear? By mid-morning, the frost began to ease its grip. Icicles dripped one by one from the eaves, ticking softly against the windowsills. Somewhere down the street, a cart rolled past, its wheels crunching over slush. The world hadn't grown warm, not yet, but it had begun to move again. Thomas stood at the window, watching the pale sun struggle through the clouds. His reflection looked less hollow today. The sleepless eyes were still there, the worry still carved deep, but there was color in his face again. Behind him, Clara hummed quietly while folding linens. Elias dozed, a thin smile resting on his lips. The city was calling again in that low, relentless way it always did. Thomas knew he couldn't stay. "He's breathing easy now," he said softly. Clara nodded, though she didn't take her eyes off the fire. "The doctor said rest would help most. I'll keep him warm." He crossed to her, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "If I'm lucky, the butcher will have more work today. If not, I'll find something." "You always do," she said simply. He hesitated, looking back at the bed. Elias stirred, half asleep. "Bring home bread?" he murmured, voice small. Thomas smiled. "Bread and maybe a sweet, if fortune smiles." The boy's lips curved upward again, and he drifted back into dreams. Outside, the air hit Thomas like a slap, sharp, clean, alive. The street was a mess of melting snow and footprints, of carts being dragged from drifts, of men with shovels clearing paths. The smell of smoke and thawing horse manure mixed in the air, the scent of a city coming back to itself. A man shouted from a corner, "Hot tea, 2 farthings a cup." Another pushed a barrow filled with coal, calling out prices. Children darted through puddles, their laughter thin but fierce. Even misery, it seemed, had thought enough to stretch its legs. Thomas joined the current of people heading toward Borough Market. Each face told a story, tired mothers clutching bread rations, dockers in patched coats, beggars holding out hats stiff with frost. But amidst it all was a rhythm, a pulse. Life hadn't been beaten, only buried for a while beneath the snow. At the market, the familiar chaos had returned. Vendors bellowed, horses snorted, coins clinked. Thomas found the butcher's stall again, half hidden behind hanging sides of meat. Mr. Hargreaves stood there as before, sleeves rolled up, his red face glowing from the cold. When he saw Thomas, he raised an eyebrow. "Back for more shoveling, Elroy?" "If there's work, sir." The butcher grunted. "Always work when London melts. Yard's a swamp of ice and sawdust." He tossed the shovel toward him. "6 pence again and mind your footing." Thomas caught the tool with steady hands. "A fair wage, sir." "Thank you." He worked all morning, clearing the yard, hauling scraps, mopping slush from the delivery floor. His breath came in steady clouds, his muscles singing with fatigue, but it was good work, honest work. Each shovelful of snow felt like clearing more than ice. It was clearing despair. Around noon, the butcher stepped out with a wrapped parcel. "Leftovers," he said gruffly. "Bits of stew meat and bone. Not for sale, mind, but I'd rather it be eaten than spoil." Thomas blinked. "You're too kind, sir." "Kind, nothing," Hargreaves snapped. "You work like a man who deserves a hot supper. Now off with you before I change my mind." Thomas smiled, tucking the parcel into his coat. He turned back toward home, the weak sunlight glinting off the puddles. For the first time in weeks, he noticed things. The glint of the river through the fog, the faint scent of bread from a nearby bakery, even a robin perched on a lamppost, feathers puffed against the cold. London was still gray, still hungry, but it was breathing again. When he reached their building, Mrs. Higgins was at the doorway, broom in hand, sweeping melted snow aside. "You look better today, Tom," she called out. "Feels better too," he replied. She nodded approvingly. "The city's cruel, but it gives back sometimes, if you outlast it." He laughed softly. "Then I'll keep outlasting it." Inside, the room smelled of warmth and broth. Elias was sitting up now, pale but smiling, his eyes bright as the door opened. Clara turned from the fire, her face lighting up at the sight of him. "You found work," she said. He nodded, setting the parcel down. "And supper." Elias clapped weakly. "Real meat?" Thomas crouched beside him. "The finest scraps in London." Clara laughed through her tears. "Then tonight we'll eat like kings." Outside, the church bells began to ring, slow, solemn, but steady. And for the first time that winter, their sound didn't feel like morning. It felt like morning. If you'd walked those streets after the storm, what would you have noticed first? The cold or the courage? Do you think hope lives in the rich or in the ones who keep walking? And if the world gave you a second sunrise, would you see it differently this time? By late afternoon, the snow had melted into narrow, shining rivers that ran along the gutters. Thomas sat by the small window, polishing his boots with a rag that had seen better days. The fire was steady. Elias slept in the bed again, this time not from sickness, but from the deep, dreamless rest of the healing. Clara hummed while darning a sleeve. Outside, someone was laughing in the street. For the first time in weeks, the sound didn't feel out of place. A soft knock came at the door. Thomas rose, wiping his hands. "That'll be Mrs. Higgins again," he said with a smile. Clara looked up. "Tell her I've tea ready if she'll stay a while." When he opened the door, the old woman stood there exactly as expected, wrapped in her worn shawl, cheeks ruddy from the cold, broom still tucked under one arm. But this time she held something else, a small wooden box about the size of a loaf of bread. "Afternoon, Tom," she said. "I've come to return a kindness." He frowned slightly. "You owe us none." "That may be," she replied, stepping inside, "but I'm an old woman and we collect debts differently than young folks." The firelight caught the box in her hands. It was polished smooth, the brass latch gleaming faintly. Thomas gestured toward the chair near the hearth. "Please sit. You'll warm faster with a story, I think." Mrs. Higgins chuckled. "Oh, there's a story all right. And a foolish one at that." She set the box on her knees, tracing the lid with one crooked finger. "My husband, rest his soul, was a watchmaker. Fine hands he had, gentle as silk. When he died, I couldn't sell his tools. Couldn't even look at them. So I locked them away." Clara folded her mending and leaned forward. "You were a watchmaker's wife?" "For 40 years, the woman said softly. "We fixed the clocks of men who never knew our names. But time was what we traded in. Time and patience." Thomas watched her carefully. "And now?" She lifted the lid. Inside, neatly arranged, lay tiny screwdrivers, files, and wheels of brass that caught the firelight like gold. Beneath them, wrapped in cloth, something heavier, a small silver watch, its chain still shining. "I've no sons to give this to," Mrs. Higgins said quietly, "and no need for time anymore. But I know a man who'll pay fair coin for the tools, and a jeweler on Walworth Street who'll buy the watch. Together, it might fetch enough for a month's rent, maybe more." Thomas blinked. "You'd sell what's left of your husband's craft for us?" She smiled faintly, the wrinkles around her eyes deepening. "No, my dear. For a boy who still has years ahead to count. Your lad's laughter reminds me what all that time was for." Clara covered her mouth, emotion tightening her throat. "We can't take it, Mrs. Higgins." "You can," the old woman said firmly. "And you must. The city takes too much from good people. Once in a while, it should give something back. Let me be the instrument." Thomas stared at the glinting tools, speechless. He thought of all the times she'd appeared at their door with coal or broth, always cheerful, always humble. He had never imagined the depth of her loss, or the quiet strength behind it. At last he said softly, "Then we'll promise you this. Elias will wear that silver watch one day when he's grown, and he'll remember who helped him see another winter." Mrs. Higgins laughed, brushing at her eyes. "Then I'd best have it cleaned before you sell it. Even a memory should shine." They all laughed, a strange, tender sound that filled the little room like sunlight. After she left, Clara stood for a long time by the window, watching the snow melt along the roofs. "Do you ever think," she asked quietly, "that people like her are what keep the world from falling apart?" Thomas joined her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Aye," he said. "The rich build the city's walls. But the poor, they keep its heart beating." Outside, Mrs. Higgins's small figure disappeared down the street, shawl fluttering like a banner in the evening wind. Inside, the box sat open on the table, catching the last of the light. Time waiting to be traded once more, but this time for hope. you had a treasure tied to someone you loved, could you let it go to save another life? Do you think love dies with the body or lingers in the hands that keep giving? And tell me, have you ever seen an old soul who made the world feel young again? The next morning was gray, brittle, and still. A thin mist hung low over the rooftops, softening the outlines of chimneys and spires. The frost had returned during the night, painting the cobblestones in a dull silver sheen. London had gone quiet again, as if catching its breath after too much noise, too much life. Thomas walked slowly, one hand clutching the wooden box wrapped in cloth. Inside lay Mrs. Higgins's watchmaker's tools, small, perfect things that had once mended the city's heartbeat. Every step felt heavier than it should. He had left early before Clara woke, not wanting her to see the look in his eyes. This was no proud errand. But necessity, he thought, rarely let a man keep his pride. The streets near Walworth were alive even in the cold. Vendors shouted prices for coal, for bread, for newsprint. Horses snorted clouds into the air, their harnesses jingling faintly. People moved quickly, heads down, each one chasing warmth, coin, or purpose. Thomas walked among them, invisible, just another shadow in the morning fog. At the corner stood the pawn shop. He knew it from the stories, a narrow building wedged between a cobbler and a baker, its front window lined with a strange kind of glitter. Broken candlesticks, brass spectacles, pocket knives, cracked violins, a child's doll with one eye gone. 100 forgotten dreams arranged for sale. He stood for a long moment before the door. His reflection looked back from the glass, tired, thin, but alive. Behind that reflection, the little silver watch gleamed faintly from within the box, as if reminding him it still had work to do. The bell above the door gave a tired ring as he entered. The air inside was warmer than expected, close, heavy with the smell of polish and old wood. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with things that once mattered to someone. Behind the counter sat an old man with a white beard and small spectacles perched low on his nose. His hands, though gnarled with age, moved delicately as he cleaned a piece of brass. He looked up without surprise. "Good morning." "Morning, sir," Thomas said. "I've come to sell." The pawnbroker nodded, setting aside his cloth. "Everyone does this time of year. Show me what you've got." Thomas placed the box on the counter, unwrapping the cloth with care. The old man's eyes sharpened as he saw the gleam of tools, the fine workmanship. "Watchmaker's tools," he murmured. "Haven't seen a set like this in years." He picked up the tiny screwdriver, turning it in the light. "Good steel. Cling. These were loved." "They were," Thomas said softly. "Belonged to a neighbor's husband. He's gone now." The pawnbroker nodded slowly. "Ah, death sells well these days. We buy the remnants of love more often than gold." He opened the silver watch last, winding it gently. The tick was faint but steady. "She kept it in fine order," he said. "You could sell this alone for 5 shillings. Thomas hesitated. "Together, then. Whatever's fair." The old man studied him, eyes narrowing slightly. "You're no trader." "No, sir." "Then I'll give you more than fair. 7 shillings. Tools and timepiece both." Thomas blinked, startled. "That's generous." The pawnbroker shrugged. "The world takes enough from honest men. Once in a while, I can choose not to." He wrapped the tools carefully, counting out the coins. The silver clinked softly into Thomas's palm, small, bright, and impossibly heavy. "Tell the widow," the man added, "that her husband's craft will mend time again. That's worth more than the coin." Thomas swallowed hard, nodding. "I will." Outside, the world looked different somehow. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing a sky the color of tin. He stood for a long time on the pavement, coins in hand, watching people hurry past. A woman carried bread wrapped in paper. A boy sold matches, shouting for attention. 2 dockworkers argued over wages. Life, endless and unrelenting, flowed around him. He turned toward home, passing once more by the pawnshop window. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw the glint of the silver watch among the clutter inside. It looked smaller now, lost among other people's losses. Yet it ticked, faintly, stubbornly, as if reminding him that not everything sold was truly gone. When he returned to the lodging house, Mrs. Higgins was sweeping the steps again. She looked up, reading the truth in his eyes before he spoke. "Well?" 7 shillings, he said quietly. The old woman whistled softly. "More than I'd hoped. Seems my George's hands still earn a living." Thomas pressed the coins into her palm. "You'll take half." "I'll do no such thing," she said, pushing his hand away. "You've got mouths to feed, I've only memories." "Keep it." He smiled, his eyes bright in the gray light. "Then I'll honor both." And when he went inside, the house seemed warmer, not from fire, but from something unseen, something carried back from the pawnbroker's dusty room. The knowledge that even the smallest acts of generosity could outlast time itself. If you had something precious, would you let it go to give someone else a chance? Do you think love can survive in the ticking of a watch, the hands of a stranger, or the weight of a coin? And tell me, what would you trade if it meant hope could keep beating one more day? The morning after the pawn shop felt different. Even the cold seemed softer, not kind exactly but less cruel. The wind had lost its bite, and somewhere above the smoky rooftops, sunlight pressed faintly through the gray. Thomas left home early again, though this time not out of worry but purpose. The small cloth pouch of coins rested in his pocket, and every step seemed lighter for it. Behind him, the tenement stirred awake. Footsteps on the stairs, children's voices echoing faintly, the sound of water being poured into tin kettles. The city was shaking off sleep. He turned down High Street, where the air smelled faintly of yeast and cinders. The bakery sat at the corner, small and square, with windows fogged from heat within. A sign above the door read, H. Willoughby and Sons. He had passed it 100 times before, never once stepping inside. Now, with a few shillings in his pocket and warmth waiting at home, he paused before the glass. Inside, rows of loaves lined the counter, round brown crusts, still steaming, dusted with flour like early snow. Behind them, the baker's wife worked silently, her sleeves rolled up, her arms powdered white. The smell was intoxicating, bread, butter, and something sweet, perhaps sugar melting on pastries. Thomas lingered there longer than he meant to. Hunger was a kind of memory, and this sense stirred it awake. The door creaked as he entered. The heat struck him first, wrapping around his cold fingers, loosening the ache in his shoulders. The woman looked up from her work, surprised to see a man in a worn coat and patched gloves. "Morning," he said, removing his cap. "How much for a loaf?" "3 farthings, she replied briskly, eyeing his hands. "If you want it warm, another half." He smiled faintly. "Warm then." As she wrapped the bread in brown paper, she hesitated. "You're the one who helped clear the street yesterday, aren't you?" "I was," he admitted. "My husband said you worked through the storm." Her tone softened. She placed not 1 but 2 loaves on the counter. "The second's from him. Said to give it to the man who shoveled the steps." Thomas blinked. "I couldn't." "You could," she interrupted gently. "You did good work, and the city needs more men who don't wait for orders to do what's right." He tried to speak, but words stuck somewhere in his throat. He only nodded, handing over the coins for 1 loaf. She wrapped them both neatly and smiled. "Tell your family to eat it while it's warm," she said. "Bread's a poor comfort cold." Outside again, the street felt brighter somehow. He stopped a moment at the window, the paper-wrapped loaves pressed against his chest, watching the baker's wife move behind the glass. An ordinary kindness in an ordinary day, yet it glowed like a miracle. The walk home was short, but he stretched it out. The air smelled of coal smoke and river mist. A cart rolled by, iron wheels hissing on wet stone. A little girl ran past, clutching a broken doll, her laughter rising like a bird through the fog. For the first time in months, Thomas smiled without effort. At the tenement, the door was open, a thin thread of steam curling out from inside. Clara looked up as he entered, wiping her hands on her apron. "You're back early." He lifted the paper parcel like a trophy. From the baker's wife, and her husband's kindness. Elias sat upright in bed now, a blanket around his shoulders, color returning to his cheeks. "Is that bread?" "Not just any bread," Thomas said, tearing the first loaf in half. "Still warm." The smell filled the little room instantly. They ate slowly, reverently, as though afraid the bread might vanish if they rushed. Clara brushed crumbs from Elias's hair. "Do you remember last winter?" she said softly. "We talked about what heaven might smell like?" Elias nodded sleepily, chewing. "It smells like this." Thomas laughed quietly. "Then maybe we're halfway there." He reached for the second loaf, still untouched, and wrapped it carefully in the brown paper again. Clara tilted her head. "For Mrs. Higgins?" "For Mrs. Higgins," he confirmed. "And anyone she chooses to share it with." When he stepped back into the street, the air felt alive again. He crossed the narrow alley to the old woman's door and knocked. She appeared, broom still in hand, the same as always, except this time, her eyes widened at the sight of the bundle. "What's this then?" "A return of kindness," he said simply. "Fresh bread." She sniffed the air and smiled. "Lord, I haven't smelled that in months. You'll spoil me, Thomas Elroy." "Good," he said. "You deserve spoiling." She took the bread with both hands, her voice soft. "You know, it's a rare thing, lad, a winter that gives something back." He nodded. "Maybe it takes all of us to make it do so." When he turned to go, the street bells began to ring noon. The sound echoed down the narrow lanes, clear and bright, mixing with the faint laughter of children and the smell of fresh bread cooling on the windowsill. And for a brief moment, even the slums of London felt like home. If someone gave you warmth when you were cold, would you remember it forever? Do you believe kindness can be passed like bread, from hand to hand, across years and walls? And tell me, when was the last time something simple made you feel rich? 2 mornings after the bread, a knock came at the door, not sharp, not hurried, but measured. 3 slow taps that carried authority. Thomas set down the bucket of melted snow he'd been using to wash the floor. Clara looked up from the hearth, her hands still dusted with flour. Even Elias, half dozing by the fire, opened his eyes. The last time they'd heard that kind of knock, death had been hovering in the room. This time it was different, calm, deliberate. Thomas opened the door to find a young boy standing there, no more than 10, wrapped in a too large coat. His cheeks were red from cold, his breath misting in the air. "Message for Mr. Elroy," he said formally, holding out a folded envelope sealed with red wax. Thomas blinked, taking it carefully. The seal was stamped with the insignia of St. Mary's Parish Infirmary. "From the doctor, sir," the boy added, eyes flicking curiously around the dim hallway. Then he tipped his cap and disappeared down the stairs before Thomas could ask more. Inside, Clara wiped her hands and moved closer. "From him?" Thomas nodded. "Seems so." He broke the seal gently. The paper inside smelled faintly of tobacco and ink, the scent of a man who belonged to another world. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, yet hurried at the edges. "Mr. Elroy, I write to inquire about your boy's condition. My rounds have kept me from your district these past days, though I think of your family often. I trust young Elias continues to recover. I enclose a small sum for medicine and nourishment. Consider it repayment for the tea you offered that night. I could not forget the warmth of your fire, nor the dignity with which you bore your hardship. London is an unkind city, but sometimes it surprises me, and reminds me why I became a doctor at all. Yours sincerely, Dr. Alastair Pembroke." Folded inside the letter was a small envelope containing 2 shining silver coins, florins. More money than Thomas had seen at once in months. He stared at them silently for a long time, the weight of them sinking in. Clara watched him, unreadable. "He didn't have to." "No," Thomas said softly. "That's what makes it heavier." She touched his arm. "Then we'll use it wisely. Coal first. Maybe milk for Elias." He nodded, but his thoughts had drifted elsewhere, to the doctor's face that night, the quiet fatigue in his eyes, the way he'd stayed without asking for anything. He remembered too how the man's coat had looked. Fine wool, stitched by hand, the sort of garment a laborer could never own. Yet beneath all that, there'd been something the same fear for a life hanging by a thread. Thomas ran a thumb over the coins, then set them on the table beside the letter. "Strange, isn't it?" he murmured. "How the same coin can mean kindness to one man and charity to another." Clara looked at him. "You feel ashamed of it?" He hesitated. "No. I wish we'd earned it by work, not by pity." She smiled sadly. "Perhaps it isn't pity. Perhaps it's gratitude, disguised as giving." Elias stirred at the sound of their voices. "Is it from the doctor?" Thomas knelt beside him, showing the coins. "It is. He remembers you." The boy smiled faintly. He had kind eyes, like he saw everything but didn't judge. Thomas smoothed his hair. "You've got a good memory for the right things." The rest of the morning passed quietly. Clara used one of the florins to buy coal and milk from a passing vendor. The other she tucked away in the small tin box beneath the floorboard beside their savings. When she lifted the plank, the faintest smell of damp wood rose, familiar, humble, but safe. That night, as the fire burned steady and the city outside groaned under the weight of another frost, Thomas sat by the window, turning the doctor's letter in his hands. The ink glimmered faintly in the firelight, like a ghost of warmth trapped in the words. He thought about writing back, about saying thank you or promising that the boy was well, or that the silver had gone to good use. But then he imagined the doctor's desk, covered in papers, his inkwell full, his hours consumed by other lives. And he thought, perhaps some gratitude should remain unspoken, kept alive like an ember. Later, as the fire dimmed and the house fell into quiet, Thomas whispered to Clara, "You ever think people like him and us, we're not meant to cross paths, yet winter pushes us together?" Clara, half asleep, murmured, "Maybe winter's the only time people remember they belong to the same world." He smiled in the dark. "A harsh way to remind us." She turned toward him. "A necessary one." Outside, the frost crept again along the window panes, silent, delicate, unstoppable. But inside, between the letter and the lingering scent of warm bread, something like spring was taking root. If someone you barely knew reached across the distance between you, would you take their hand or pull away? Do you think gratitude belongs in words, or in what we choose to remember? And tell me, what's worth more to you, a coin given or a kindness that never asks for thanks? The thaw had begun. Not loudly, London never did anything loudly except starve or riot, but quietly in small, secret ways. Icicles melted one drop at a time. Puddles formed beneath wagons, reflecting a sky that was more gray-blue than gray. Even the crows seemed less desperate in their cries. Inside the Elroy room, the air no longer bit. The fire hummed steadily, the smell of boiled milk lingering faintly, mixed with coal and soap. Clara sat by the hearth, mending socks by soft light, while Thomas carved a bit of scrap wood into something vaguely boat-shaped. He didn't know what it would become, only that it helped to keep his hands busy and his mind quiet. Elias was awake. Not merely awake, alive in a way that filled the little room with brightness. He was sitting up, a blanket around his shoulders, staring out the window as though the world beyond the glass were a secret he might someday learn. His hair stuck up at odd angles. His cheeks had regained that faint bloom of pink. When he turned to his mother, his eyes were clear. "Can I stand today?" he asked. Clara looked up from her stitching. For weeks, that question had been a whisper of despair. Now it was asked with quiet certainty. She smiled, setting aside her work. "If your legs agree with you, my love." Thomas set down his carving, rising slowly. "Let's help him try." Elias gripped his father's hands, small fingers against rough palms, and swung his feet over the side of the bed. His breath caught at the cold of the floorboards, but he didn't pull back. The world tilted for a moment, his knees trembling. Then inch by inch he pushed upward. "Easy now," Thomas murmured. "No rush." The sound of the fire filled the silence, that soft crackle like breathing itself. Clara rose too, her hand hovering close to her son's shoulder, afraid to touch, afraid to startle the miracle. Elias wobbled, found his balance, and took one careful step toward the table. Just one. But it was enough to make the air itself feel warmer. He turned back, smiling, a real smile, wide and boyish and alive. "I did it." Thomas laughed, a sound deeper than the room had heard in months. "You did." Clara pressed both hands to her mouth, laughter and tears tangled together. Outside, a cart rolled past, its iron wheels hissing over melting snow. Somewhere, a bell rang, not mournful this time, but bright like a morning call. "Again," Elias said. "I can do it again." He took another step, this one surer, then another toward the window. He stopped before it, bracing his hand against the sill, staring out at the street below where a boy in a red cap dragged a sled through the slush. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't the one being carried. "Do you see that?" he whispered. "The snow's going away." Clara joined him, wrapping her shawl around both their shoulders. "It'll be back," she said gently. "I don't mind," he replied. "If it goes away once, it means it can go again." Thomas chuckled, moving behind them. Spoken like a true Londoner, ready to argue with the weather. The family stayed like that for a long time. The three of them framed by the small window, the fire behind them, the city before. The simplest tableau, yet it carried the weight of survival, the quiet victory of endurance. Later, as the sun dipped low, Mrs. Higgins came knocking. When she saw Elias standing, her eyes went wide, her hand flying to her chest. "Lord have mercy, look at you," she exclaimed. "You're upright." Elias grinned. "Nearly tall as you now." "Cheeky boy," she said, laughing. "Your poor mother'll have her hands full before summer." She placed a bundle on the table, scraps of fabric, bits of old twine, a spool of blue thread. "Found these while tidying. Thought Clara might turn them into something useful." Clara touched the cloth reverently. "They're perfect. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Mrs. Higgins said with mock sternness. "You'll curse my name once you prick your fingers sewing." They all laughed. It felt strange and wonderful, this laughter, as if the walls themselves were loosening after being clenched for too long. When the old woman left, evening settled softly over the street. The lamplighter's steps echoed through the slush below, his pole rising and falling, flames blooming one by one along the narrow lane. Elias sat on the edge of the bed again, exhausted but triumphant. Thomas tucked the blanket around him. That was enough adventure for one day. The boy nodded, still smiling. "Tomorrow I'll walk to the door." "And the next day?" "To the bakery." Thomas laughed quietly. "Ambitious." "I want to tell the baker's wife thank you," Elias said seriously. Clara kissed his forehead. "You will, my heart. When the world's ready for your steps again." They sat by the fire until long after he fell asleep, the flames painting their faces gold and soft. And though outside the wind rose again, whispering along the rooftops, the little room stood firm, a single island of warmth in a cold city. Because a boy had stood. Because hope, like him, had learned to walk again. If you'd watched someone you loved take their first step after pain, would you remember the sound of it forever? Do you think hope can be taught, or is it something the heart remembers on its own? And tell me, what's the smallest miracle you've ever seen that felt larger than life? The river was awake before the city was. It moved beneath a skin of ice, slow and silver, carrying the breath of fog toward the docks. Barges creaked. Chains groaned. Somewhere a gull cried, a lonely, ragged sound that felt older than London itself. Thomas stood at the edge of the quay watching the mist rise. He hadn't been here in weeks, not since the accident, not since the long stretch of hunger and fear. The smell of tar and brine filled his chest like a forgotten prayer. Men were already at work, hauling crates, shouting orders, stamping their boots to fight the cold. The rhythm was familiar, heavy, harsh, alive. And within it, Thomas felt something stirring again. Not pride exactly, but belonging. He flexed his injured hand. The scar had tightened the skin, but strength had begun to return. He rubbed it once, then stepped forward. A foreman in a thick coat turned as he approached. "Elroy, is it?" Thomas nodded. "Aye, sir." The man squinted. "Didn't think I'd see you again after that fall." "Hand mended?" "As best as it can." "You were a good worker." The foreman's tone softened slightly. "We've got lighter loads today. Coal sacks and crates for the ships to Tilbury. Pays 6 pence if you last the day." Thomas smiled faintly. "6 pence will do just fine." The man jerked his head. "Then get to it." And just like that, the rhythm returned. Muscle and sweat, rope and timber, the smell of salt in the air. Thomas fell into it like a man remembering an old dance. Each lift sent pain through his hand, but the pain felt honest, earned, clean. Around him, the world pulsed with life. Men called to one another in rough jokes. The cranes groaned overhead, hauling crates through the fog. Somewhere down the quay, someone began to whistle a tune, thin, reedy, but cheerful. At midday, the bell rang for break. Thomas sat on a coil of rope, eating a piece of bread Clara had packed for him. The crust was hard, but the inside still soft, still warm. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the river wind wash over his face. A man nearby, broad-shouldered, soot-streaked, nodded toward him. "You're the Elroy who lives near Borough, aren't you?" Thomas looked up. "I am. Why?" "Word's gone round," the man said, tearing his own bread. "Your boy pulled through." "That true?" Thomas smiled slowly. "It is." The man grinned. "Then drink to that tonight. God knows this city could use more good news." They shared a laugh, a small, rough sound carried away by the wind. When work resumed, the afternoon light slanted low, turning the fog gold around the ship masts. Thomas caught himself watching the horizon, imagining the ships sailing out beyond the ice, beyond the gray. He wondered what it might be like to follow them someday, to see a sky that wasn't weighed down by smoke. But then he thought of Elias standing at the window, of Clara's tired smile, of the bread cooling on their table, and knew he belonged right here. As the sun sank behind the warehouses, the foreman approached, a ledger in his hand. "Good work today, Elroy. You held your own." "Thank you, sir. Come back tomorrow. We'll need steady hands through week's end." Thomas nodded, taking the small stack of coins offered. They were warm from the foreman's glove, warm with the proof that he'd earned them. The walk home was long but easy. The streets glistened under melting snow, lamplight shimmered in puddles. He passed a group of children rolling a snowball in the slush, their laughter echoing down the narrow alley. It was a sound he carried with him all the way back. When he reached the tenement, the fire was already lit. Clara turned from the stove as he entered, her face soft with exhaustion and pride. "You're covered in soot," she said, half laughing, half scolding. He grinned. "Means I've been working." Elias was sitting near the hearth, his wooden boat from Thomas's carving balanced on his knees. "Did you bring stories, Papa?" Thomas sat down beside him, still smelling of the docks. "Always." He described the ships, their tall masts vanishing into fog, the men shouting in unison, the frozen ropes creaking like voices of ghosts. Elias listened wide-eyed, fingers tracing the curve of the toy boat. "One day," he said, "I'll build one that really sails." Thomas smiled, touching the boy's shoulder. "Then you'll need a strong crew." "I already have one," Elias said. "You and Mama." Clara laughed softly. "Then we'd better learn to swim." The room filled with that laughter, real, full, alive. Outside, the river kept moving, steady as breath. Inside, a family did the same. If you lost the work that defined you, would you have the courage to start again? Do you think strength comes from muscle, or from the heart that keeps returning? And tell me, when you earn your next small victory, will you pause long enough to feel it? It came on a Thursday morning, wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. The letter was folded neatly inside, the edges smudged with fingerprints and sea salt. Thomas found it wedged beneath the door when he came in from fetching coal, the name Mr. T. Elroy, written in a firm, unfamiliar hand. He turned it over once, twice, feeling its weight. Letters never came for men like him, only notices, bills, or bad news. Clara looked up from the fire, brow furrowed. "Who's writing to you?" "I don't know," he said softly, breaking the seal. The wax cracked like thin ice. The paper inside smelled faintly of ship tar and damp rope. "Dock office, Tilbury Quay. Mr. Elroy. We are short-handed at the lower wharf. Your name came recommended by Foreman H. Graves. We can offer steady work through the spring loading grain ships for export. Lodging provided near the docks. Wages 1 shilling and 3 per day. Report within 7 days if you are willing. Respectfully, *W. Cooper, Dock Superintendent." Thomas read it twice before he spoke. "They're offering me work," he said slowly, the words strange on his tongue. "Real work. Tilbury." Clara blinked. "Tilbury? That's half a day's travel." "Aye." He folded the paper, staring at the creases. "They'd lodge me there. Good pay, better than anything here." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the hiss of coal. Elias looked between them, confused. "You'd leave London?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Just for a while. Until the cold's gone and the ships are filled." "But you'd be gone," Clara whispered. Her voice wasn't angry, only afraid. He crossed to her, taking her hands. "It's for you and the boy. For warmth, for food, for something steady." Her eyes glistened. "We've only just come back to living, Tom." He said nothing for a long time. The fire cracked softly. Outside, a carriage passed, wheels grinding through the half-thawed mud. Finally, he said, "I promised myself I'd take any chance that came. We've been one rent payment away from the street all winter. This could change that." Clara nodded slowly, but her lips trembled. "And what if another storm comes? What if Elias?" He shook his head gently. "He's strong now. You're strong. And Mrs. Higgins won't let you starve while I'm gone." At the mention of her name, there came a knock, as if conjured. The old woman entered, cheeks flushed from the cold, broom still tucked under one arm. "Talking about me, are you?" she said, smiling. Thomas held out the letter. "Word travels fast, but perhaps not this fast." She squinted at the page, mouthing the words as she read. Then she let out a low whistle. "Tilbury. Proper docks. Real work, that is." Clara frowned. "And real danger." Mrs. Higgins nodded solemnly. "Aye, but danger's part of living, dear. So sacrifice. A man takes a ship for those he loves, not for the sea. Thomas smiled at that. You sound like a preacher. Just old, she said, grinning. And old folk know what it costs to stand still. That night, they talked long after Elias had fallen asleep. The letter lay open on the table, fluttering each time the door draft came through. The room was warm, the kind of warmth they had fought for all winter, and yet it felt fragile, like it might vanish when he left. Maybe, Clara said finally, this is what survival looks like. Not comfort, just the courage to keep going. Thomas brushed his thumb across her knuckles. I'll write every week. She smiled faintly. Even if it's just to say you're still breathing. Especially for that, he said. He packed what little he owned, a spare shirt, a wool cap, a small wooden carving of Elias's boat. Mrs. Higgins came by with a parcel of bread and dried apples, muttering that no man should leave home hungry. When dawn came, the city was wrapped in fog again, not cruel this time but watchful. At the door, Thomas knelt to hug Elias. The boy clung tightly, the way children do when they don't yet know how to measure distance. You'll come back before spring? Elias asked. Thomas smiled, ruffling his hair. If the river allows it. And if it doesn't? Then I'll build one of my own. Clara stood in the doorway, shawl drawn tight. Go before the light fades. He nodded, the weight of her eyes following him as he stepped into the gray morning. The street smelled of thawing snow and coal smoke. He turned once, just once, to see them both framed in the doorway, the firelight behind them, the only color in a colorless world. Then he walked on, the letter in his coat pocket, toward Tilbury and the waiting sea. If the world asked you to choose between love and survival, which would you hold tighter? Do you think distance weakens the heart or teaches it how to keep beating? And tell me, if you had to leave everything behind, what small thing would you carry to remember home? The fog arrived before the ships. Thick and pale, it rolled off the Thames like smoke from some sleeping giant. It muffled everything, sound, shape, time. When Thomas stepped onto Tilbury's dock that morning, it felt as though he'd entered another world entirely. The wooden planks were slick beneath his boots. The air stung of salt and coal dust. Ropes creaked somewhere unseen, and the slow groan of a mooring post echoed through the mist like a living thing. New hand? Someone barked nearby. Thomas turned toward the voice, though he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. A shadow emerged, a man in a heavy oilskin coat, pipe glowing faintly through the fog. "Aye," Thomas replied. "Elroy." Foreman Graves sent word. The man grunted, smoke curling through his teeth. "You're the London one. Said you've got a good back and a bad hand. We'll see which one wins." He jerked his head toward a dim outline of cranes and stacked crates. "You'll start on the lighter loads till we know your worth." Thomas nodded. "Understood." The man's face softened a little. "Name's Cooper. You answered to me." That was the name from the letter. The dock superintendent himself, a man built like a piling, scarred by wind and labor. He gestured toward the wharf. "Work starts with the tide. Don't fall in, the river eats slow and the fog hides the sound." And just like that, Thomas began again. The work was brutal. Sacks of grain heavy as sin, barrels slick with frost, ropes biting into his palms. The fog never lifted, only thinned and thickened like breath. Men shouted names he couldn't see, answered calls from voices that might have been 10 feet or 10 miles away. But there was rhythm. There was purpose. Each haul, each lift, each shouted heave, built a small, defiant kind of music. He felt his muscles remember what hunger had taken from them. His lungs filled with air so cold it burned clean. During breaks, they gathered around barrels of fire, steam rising from wet coats. The men were rough but not unkind. There was Jack Roper, who swore he'd once worked for the Navy and claimed the river still owed him wages. There was Callum, quiet and quick, who wrote letters to his mother every week but never posted them, said she'd been gone 3 years. And there was Oates, a boy not much older than Elias, who carried more weight than he should have but smiled anyway. Thomas listened more than he spoke. The fog made conversation feel sacred, each word small, deliberate, floating in the cold air before fading away. At night, the lodgings were spare. One narrow bed, one small stove, one cracked window that looked out onto nothing but mist. Yet when Thomas lay down, exhaustion felt cleaner than hunger ever had. He'd earned this weariness. It belonged to him. One evening, as the tide turned and the lamps along the quay flickered to life, Thomas walked to the edge of the dock. The water below was black, shifting, endless. He took the small wooden boat from his pocket, the one Elias had carved before he left, and set it on the surface. For a moment, it floated perfectly still, the reflection of its tiny mast trembling in the lamplight. Then a ripple took it, carrying it out toward the open river until the fog swallowed it whole. He smiled faintly. "Sail well, little one." Behind him, Cooper's voice broke the silence. "Talking to ghosts, Elroy?" Thomas turned. The older man was leaning against a post, watching him through the haze. "Talking to home," Thomas said simply. Cooper nodded. "Best kind of ghosts." He lit his pipe, the glow flickering like a star through the fog. "You work hard. That'll take you far here. But don't let the river fool you, she gives nothing for free." Thomas met his eyes. "Neither does life." The two men stood there for a long while, saying nothing more, the tide whispering beneath them. When Thomas returned to his room that night, he wrote his first letter to Clara. The ink bled slightly from the damp, the word simple. "Safe and working. The fog here breathes like a living thing. I see the river from my window and it reminds me of your eyes, steady and full of light even in gray days. Tell Elias I'll bring him stories of ships, and perhaps one day a piece of the sea." He folded the page, sealed it with wax, and left it by the door for the morning post. Outside, the fog thickened again, rolling slow and quiet through Tilbury's narrow streets. But somewhere in that endless gray, Thomas felt something unexplainable, not hope exactly, but motion. As though life, once frozen, had begun again to flow. If you found yourself in a place where the world vanished into fog, would you feel lost or free? Do you think home is where you stay or where your heart keeps writing to? And tell me, if you sent one letter across the distance tonight, who would you write to first? It began with a letter every Sunday. No one had agreed to that schedule, but somehow both hearts kept the same time. Thomas would finish work on the docks, wash the grit from his hands, and sit by the little stove in his room. The light there was poor, just a single oil lamp and a scrap of wick, but he'd lean close, writing slow and careful, afraid to waste even one drop of ink. "Dearest Clara, the fog's been thick all week. Sometimes I can't see the ships until they groan right out of the mist like ghosts. The men say the river's haunted. I tell them it's just homesick, same as us. I keep your shawl folded at the end of my bed. It still smells faintly of coal smoke and bread. Tell Elias I saw a boat today with red sails and I thought of his little wooden one. I think the river would have carried them side by side." He'd sign his name, sometimes with shaking hands, seal the page and leave it by the door for the morning post. Then he'd sit for a long while, listening to the slow sigh of the river, and imagine her reading. Back in London, Clara waited. The postman always came mid-morning, boots echoing in the narrow hallway. When the letter slid under the door, she'd drop whatever she was doing, laundry, mending, stirring the pot, and run to pick it up like a child finding treasure. The paper was always damp at the corners, the ink smudged from sea air. But inside, the words glowed like fire. "My beloved Thomas, your letter reached us with the fog itself." The boy pressed it to his cheek as though the words might warm him. "He's walking farther every day now, to the door, to the stairs, even to the corner of the street where Mrs. Higgins scolds him for inviting pneumonia. The snow has gone, but London still feels gray. I keep the fire lit long after dark, so the room feels less empty. I sleep better when I imagine you by it." The letters became their world. They spoke of ordinary things, the price of bread, the sound of church bells, the color of the sky. Yet between the lines ran a current stronger than the river that divided them. Each week the words grew gentler, braver. Clara wrote about Elias's laughter returning. Thomas wrote about the dockhands sharing stories over tea. She sent pressed flowers between the pages. He sent a button carved from driftwood. One night, when the wind rattled the window frames and the river outside roared like thunder, Thomas found himself writing words he'd never dared say aloud. "Sometimes when I see the tide coming in, I think of how it touches both our shores. That's what keeps me steady, the thought that somewhere upstream you're hearing the same water against your window." He paused, pen trembling, then added, "If I ever return to you, it will be by following that sound." He sealed the letter before he could change his mind. Weeks passed. The fog came and went. Ships arrived from France and Spain, heavy with cargo and stories. The men shouted, cursed, laughed, and sometimes sang rough, sailor songs that drifted through the night. Thomas kept to his rhythm. Work, write, sleep. The ache of distance was dull but constant, like a bruise that never fully healed. One evening, Cooper, the dock superintendent, found him writing by the stove. "Still putting words on paper?" he asked, lighting his pipe. Thomas nodded. "It's all that keeps the days from blurring." Cooper chuckled. "A man who writes letters every week must have someone worth writing to." "I do." "Then she's luckier than most." When Clara's next letter came, it was shorter than usual, the ink lighter. "Elias asks when you'll be home. I tell him soon. Mrs. Higgins says she dreams of ships, and in each one there's a man waving goodbye. The nights are long, but your words fill them. Write when you can. I keep every letter in the box you gave me, the one that used to hold the doctor's silver coins." Thomas folded the paper against his heart before sleeping. Outside, fog pressed against the window like a hand. He could almost believe it was hers. If you could only speak through letters, what would you choose to write? Truth or comfort? Do you think love fades with distance or grows quieter and deeper like a river under ice? And tell me, if someone kept every word you ever wrote, would you still write the same way? The wind changed first. It began as a whisper through the rigging, then deepened into a moan that shook the lamps on their hooks. By dusk, the sky had sunk into itself, thick clouds rolling low over Tilbury, swallowing the last of the light. Thomas felt it in his bones before he saw it. The air tasted metallic the way it does before a storm, sharp, electric, ancient. He stood on the dock beside Cooper, watching the tide rise faster than usual. "Looks bad," Cooper muttered. "She'll roar tonight." Thomas nodded. "The river's angry." "She always is," Cooper said, pulling his coat tighter. "But she remembers who's weak." That night, the storm came in full. Rain like fists, wind that howled through every gap in the boards, waves slamming against the quay hard enough to make the ground tremble. The men ran ropes across the moorings, shouting through the wind, their lanterns vanishing in bursts of spray. Thomas worked until his fingers went numb. The ropes cut into his palms, the salt burned his eyes, but he didn't stop. The thought of home kept him upright, Clara's shawl, Elias's laughter, the steady warmth of the small fire in their room. When the storm finally broke near dawn, Tilbury was a ruin of sound and silence. The docks were littered with torn canvas, barrels smashed, a ship half sunk near the wharf. Thomas sat on a crate, soaked and shivering, watching the gray water churn. He thought of the river carrying this same fury upriver toward London. "Maybe they're hearing it too," he whispered to himself. In London, Clara did hear it. The wind came howling down the narrow lanes like an animal unchained. Windows rattled, chimneys screamed. The rain beat against the glass, steady and merciless. Elias clung to her arm, his eyes wide. "Will Papa be all right?" "He's strong," she said softly, though her voice shook. "The storm can't take him." But when dawn came and the postman didn't, her faith began to fray. For months, his letters had come like clockwork, damp, late, sometimes smudged, but always there. Now there was nothing. One day passed, then two, then 5. She told herself the river had slowed the post, that fog or rain had delayed the coach. But each empty morning scraped her thinner. At night, when Elias slept, she sat by the window, tracing raindrops on the glass, whispering words into the wind. "Come back to us." Mrs. Higgins noticed the silence too. "No letter this week?" she asked one morning, sweeping her doorway. Clara shook her head. "Not yet. Storm like that, half the barges'll be stuck at Gravesend. Post'll catch up soon enough." But the older woman's eyes betrayed her doubt. Back at Tilbury, the postroom was in chaos. Dozens of letters lay ruined, ink bled into paper, envelopes torn, names lost to the tide. Thomas's last letter, the one he'd written before the storm, was among them, the edges blackened with damp, unreadable. When he learned of it, he stood for a long time staring at the water. All his words, his small attempts to stay close, had been washed away. That evening he tried to write again. His hands trembled with exhaustion. His candle guttered in the draft. The first few words came slowly, painfully. "Dearest Clara, the storm has broken us all. But I'm still here, still standing. If this letter finds you, know that the river did not win." He stopped, staring at the page. The ink smeared as a drop of water, maybe from the leaking ceiling, maybe from his own tears, spread across the words. He smiled faintly, bitterly. So be it. He folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and set it beside the lamp. Whether it reached her or not, he didn't know. In London, the days stretched long and gray. Elias stopped asking about the post. Clara moved through her chores like a ghost, lighting the fire, washing the floor, waiting. Every sound, a knock, a shout in the street, the roll of a cart, made her heart leap, then sink again. One evening, she found one of Thomas's old letters fallen behind the chest of drawers. The paper was torn, the ink faded. She unfolded it, smoothing the creases with trembling hands. "If I ever return to you, it will be by following the sound of the river." She read it over and over until the words blurred. Then she whispered to the window as though he might somehow hear it across the miles. "The river still sings, Thomas. Come home." The storm passed as all storms do. But it left behind silence, deep, unbroken, like snow over graves. And yet, somewhere in that silence, a single sound remained. The faint ticking of a silver watch, steady as the heart that refused to give up. If the words you loved were washed away, would you find new ones to write, or wait for silence to speak? Do you think storms destroy what we build, or only reveal what truly lasts? And tell me, when the world goes quiet after the wind, whose name do you still hear? It was almost 3 weeks after the storm when the letter found its way home. Clara wasn't expecting it anymore. By then, she'd accepted silence as part of her days. She still rose early, still mended, still lit the fire, but she did it as if moving through fog, each motion slow, deliberate, hollow. The knock came while she was kneeling by the hearth. A single rap, hesitant, uncertain. When she opened the door, it wasn't the postman. It was a boy from the docks, clothes stiff with salt, hands raw from work. He looked no older than 12. "Message for Mrs. Elroy," he said, fumbling in his coat. "Washed up near Gravesend. They said you'd want it." She took the envelope before she could breathe. The paper was wrinkled, edges torn, the ink bled in places like bruises. The wax seal had half melted, but she could still make out the faint curve of Thomas's handwriting. The boy tipped his cap. "They say it's been to sea and back." Clara tried to thank him, but the words caught in her throat. She pressed a penny into his hand, and when he left, she stood alone in the quiet, staring down at the thing that had traveled farther than any of them ever had. She carried it to the table and sat. The firelight danced across the paper, turning every stain into a shimmer. For a long time she couldn't open it. Her fingers trembled too much. At last, she drew a slow breath and broke what was left of the seal. The letter unfolded like a fragile wing. The first few lines were nearly lost, but the ink had held enough. "Dearest Clara, the storm has broken us all, but I'm still here, still standing. If this letter finds you, know that the river did not win. Asterisk." She gasped softly, as though the words themselves had stepped through the door. Further down, the writing grew fainter, as if the sea had tried to swallow it but failed. "When the wind howls, I think of your fire. When the fog blinds us, I remember your voice. If ever I doubt that I exist, I trace my name through the mist and wait for it to fade, because that's what you taught me, to leave marks even when they vanish." She pressed the paper to her chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. It wasn't a farewell. It was a promise that had taken the long way home. That night, she read it aloud to Mrs. Higgins, who sat across from her with folded hands and a knowing smile. The old woman's eyes glistened in the firelight. "The river gives back what it owes, sooner or later," she murmured. "It's stubborn, but it remembers." Clara nodded. "He wrote this weeks ago. Maybe more." "Then he's still alive," Mrs. Higgins said firmly. "A drowned man leaves no ink." The words made Clara laugh, a small, broken laugh that felt like breathing again. Elias stirred from his blanket on the floor. "Is it from Papa?" "It is, my heart," she whispered. "He's well." The boy sat up, eyes wide. "Did he say when he'll come home?" She hesitated, then smiled softly. "So, he said soon." The child grinned, wrapping his blanket around his shoulders like a sailor's cloak. "Then I'll wait by the window every day." Days passed. Clara folded the letter carefully, drying it near the fire, pressing it flat between the pages of the family Bible. Each night, she'd open it again, tracing the words with her finger, letting them become part of her. The stains of the river didn't frighten her anymore. They felt holy, proof that something written in love could survive the water, the wind, the distance. Meanwhile, in Tilbury, Thomas never knew the letter had reached her. He kept writing every Sunday, though no reply came. Sometimes, he thought the silence meant the storm had taken her words the way it had taken his. But one morning as he stood on the dock watching the sunrise turn the fog to gold, he felt, deep down without reason, that something had changed. He couldn't have explained it, but the river seemed calmer, almost kind, as if it had delivered something and been forgiven. He smiled faintly, whispering into the mist, "You found her, didn't you?" The tide lapped against the wood, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat answering back. That evening, Clara sat by the fire again, holding the letter close, her lips moving as she read the final line once more. "If this letter finds you, know that the river did not win." She looked out the window where snow had begun to fall again, light, quiet, gentle this time. For the first time in many weeks, she didn't feel afraid of the silence. Because silence now meant he was still out there, still writing, still fighting, still following the river home. If a letter you loved took weeks to return, would you still open it, or fear what it might say? Do you think words can survive distance, or do they change while they travel like people do? And tell me, if the sea carried your message away, would you trust it to bring it back someday? The snow began to melt the same week Thomas was told the river was passable again. 4 months he had watched the tides come and go, working where he could, unloading barges, repairing ropes, sweeping the docks long after the ships had left. Each day bled into the next, gray sky, gray water, gray men. But when the foreman finally said, "London boats leaving tomorrow," something in his chest stirred. Not excitement. Not quite. Something quieter, like a cold catching light after long darkness. That night he packed the few things he owned. His coat. A small knife. The watch Clara had given him years ago when Elias was still a baby. It had stopped ticking during the storm, but he carried it anyway. "Keep time for us both," she'd said once. He tried. The next morning dawned pale and misty. The ferry waited like a patient beast, its hull coated in frost, the deck slick with ice. Thomas boarded without looking back. The river stretched before him, gray, endless, and alive. He stood at the rail as Tilbury shrank behind him, the cranes and warehouses fading into fog. The wind off the Thames was cold but familiar. He whispered to the water as if it might remember him. "You've taken enough. Give something back now." The ferry moved slow against the current. The journey upriver took hours, winding through silence broken only by the creak of ropes and the distant cry of gulls. But to Thomas, every bend brought him closer, to the narrow street in Whitechapel, the cracked window, the fire that never quite died. When the skyline of London finally rose ahead, it seemed unreal. The spires and chimneys, the curls of smoke, the sound of bells cutting through the fog, like a dream made of coal and memory. Clara didn't know what drew her to the window that morning. Habit maybe, or hope refusing to die. The street below was half mud, half snow. Children ran between puddles, their laughter echoing against brick walls. Then she saw him. At first just a dark figure at the far end of the street, head bowed, shoulders heavy under a coat that had seen too many storms. She froze, afraid to believe her own eyes. Then he lifted his head, and even through the fog she knew. The kettle slipped from her hand, clattering against the floor. By the time he reached the door, she was already there. Neither spoke at first. The world outside seemed to fade, the sounds of the street, the distant bells, even the soft hiss of melting snow. Only the small space between them existed. Thomas raised a trembling hand, brushing his fingers against her cheek as if to confirm she was real. "You got my letter?" he said softly. "I did," she whispered. "It came home, after the sea." He smiled then, a slow, weary smile that cracked the mask of months apart. And in that moment, the silence between them became full, of everything they hadn't said, every night spent waiting, every small hope kept alive like an ember. Elias appeared in the doorway behind her, rubbing sleep from his eyes. When he saw the man standing there, he blinked once, then shouted, "Papa!" Thomas dropped to his knees just in time to catch him. The boy's arms went tight around his neck, his laughter breaking into sobs. "I waited," Elias gasped between breaths. "I waited by the window every day." "I know," Thomas whispered, "and I found my way by it." That evening the three of them sat by the fire. The same fire that had burned through hunger, through fear, through silence. Clara brewed the last of the tea. Thomas told stories about the docks, about gulls that stole bread and ships that sang in fog. Elias listened wide-eyed, clutching his father's hand as if afraid he might vanish again. Outside, the city thawed slowly. Water dripped from eaves, ran in narrow streams down cobblestones. The air smelled of coal and damp earth, but also of something new. Spring wasn't here yet, but its promise had arrived. Before bed, Thomas took out the broken watch. It still didn't tick, but when he opened the case, inside was a small folded scrap. The last letter Clara had written before the storm, never posted. When the river is cruel, I'll still wait by the window. The world may turn cold, but you will always know the way by the firelight. He closed the watch and held it to his heart. I did, he whispered. I found the light. Outside, snow began to fall again, faint, soft, harmless. The river moved quietly through the city, carrying its secrets, its letters, its memories. For now, the Clarks had enough: warmth, laughter, and the rarest treasure of all, peace. The kind you don't notice until it fills the room. If you'd waited through storms for someone you loved, would you still recognize their face when they returned? Do you think home is a place, or the moment when two people breathe the same quiet air again? And tell me, if the river carried someone away from you, would you still stand by it every morning, waiting for them to come back? By February's close, the frost loosened its grip on London. The great city seemed to exhale, roofs dripping, chimneys sighing, the cobblestones shining dark with thaw. The river that had once frozen now flowed again, wide and slow, carrying silt, memory, and forgiveness. Thomas woke to the sound of it, a soft murmur through the open window. For months he had heard only the wind's cruelty, the shuffle of hunger, the groan of the docks under ice. But now the water sang again. He sat on the edge of the bed, the weak sunlight touching his face. Clara stirred beside him, half asleep, murmuring something about tea. Elias, already awake, was tracing lines on the frost that still lingered on the window pane. "Papa," he said suddenly, "the ice looks like tiny roads." Thomas smiled. "Then follow them, lad. They'll take you to spring." The boy laughed, the kind of laughter that fills a room and makes you forget how empty it used to feel. Later that morning, Thomas stepped outside. The streets were still slick but alive. Women shook out rugs from windows, men patched roofs, the milk cart rattled down the lane, its wheels cutting through melting snow. Everywhere, people were talking again, about work, about prices, about weather. Ordinary things. Beautiful things. He passed Mrs. Higgins's door and saw her sweeping, the usual scarf tied around her head. "Morning to you, Mr. Elroy," she called. "Back among the living, are we?" "Trying to be," he said with a grin. She looked him up and down. "You filled out. Must be the wife's cooking." He chuckled. "And her scolding." She laughed, the sound echoing down the narrow lane like sunlight. It was the same laugh that had carried through the worst nights of winter, when she'd come knocking with broth or news or a shared complaint about the landlord. Thomas realized then that survival hadn't been the miracle, kindness had. By midday, he returned to find Clara sitting by the window with her sewing, the light falling soft across her face. Elias was at the table, carving something small from a scrap of wood. The sound of it, gentle scraping, the rhythm of life returning, was better than any song. "What are you making?" Thomas asked, leaning over. "A ship," Elias said proudly, "like the one that brought you home." He turned it in his hands, a small, uneven boat, rough but full of care. It reminded Thomas of the wooden toy Tom Higgins had carved for him months ago, during the worst of the storm. That one still sat on the mantel, its edges worn smooth by small fingers. "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that every man should have something like this to remind him what he's sailing toward." Elias smiled. "I'm building more. For other boys." Clara looked up, smiling faintly. The city could use more ships, and more sailors who come home. That evening, as the sun set behind the rooftops, Thomas stepped outside again. The air was cool, but it no longer hurt to breathe. Smoke rose from chimneys in lazy curls. The sky was streaked with pale gold, like the first promise of better days. He thought of all that winter had taken, and all it had left behind. The broken pipes now repaired. The neighbors closer than before. The doctor who still visited sometimes, not just for illness but for tea. And the letter, the one that had come home through the tide, now resting in the family Bible, safe between its pages. He realized then that winter hadn't truly been the enemy. It had simply been the mirror, showing them what they were capable of when everything else was stripped away. Strength, compassion, hope. As dusk fell, he heard the faint bells of St. Paul's drifting through the air. Their sound mingled with laughter from the street below, with the creak of carts, the chatter of life. He closed his eyes and whispered, "We made it." Inside, Clara lit the lamp. Elias hummed to himself, rocking his little wooden boat across the table. The flames' glow touched their faces, painting them in warmth that had nothing to do with fire. Outside, the snow melted into the gutter, carrying winter's last tears into the river. The same river that had once taken their letters, their faith, their sleep. Now it gave back peace. Tell me, do you think spring arrives all at once, or does it creep in quietly like forgiveness? Do you believe people change after a hard winter, or do they simply remember who they were all along? And when the world begins again, what is the first thing you thank it for? The lamps of London glowed that night like constellations fallen to earth. And in one small room on Tanner's Lane, a family slept beneath the sound of a thawing world. Safe, full, and human. Winter had not won. It had only taught them how to begin again.